The morning of October 15th dawned with the crisp clarity that promised perfection for the most anticipated wedding of the London season. At precisely 10:30, the elite of British society had gathered within the opulent confines of Ashworth Manor's grand ballroom, transformed for the occasion into a cathedral of white roses and golden candlelight. The very air seemed to shimmer with expectation and the rustle of silk as 200 of England's most distinguished guests took their places for the union of Miss Seraphina Ashworth and Sir Reginald Pembroke. The bride herself was considered the season's most coveted prize. At 24, Seraphina possessed not only the ethereal beauty that graced society portraits, but also the considerable fortune of the Ashworth textile empire. Her engagement to Sir Reginald, heir to the Pembroke shipping dynasty and a man of impeccable breeding, if not youth, had been orchestrated with the precision of a military campaign by their respective families. It was, by all accounts, a marriage that would benefit everyone involved, combining two of England's most powerful commercial interests under one magnificent roof. The ceremony had been scheduled to commence at 11 o'clock sharp. Sir Reginald stood at the improvised altar, resplendent in his morning coat, his silver hair perfectly groomed despite the nervous perspiration that betrayed his composure. Beside him, his best man and younger brother, Captain Charles Pembroke, checked his pocket watch with increasing frequency. The organist, Mrs. Pemberton Wells, a formidable woman whose opinions could make or break reputations, had already played the processional twice, her fingers beginning to show the strain of repetition. By 11:15, the polite murmurs had grown to barely concealed whispers. Lady Margaret Ashworth, Seraphina's stepmother and a woman whose iron will had guided the family through decades of social climbing, rose from her seat in the front row. Her face, usually a masterpiece of controlled elegance, had taken on the pallor of expensive porcelain. She exchanged urgent whispers with Lord Ashworth, whose own countenance had darkened considerably from its usual jovial demeanour. It was then that Jenkins, the head butler, appeared at the ballroom's ornate double doors. His usually imperturbable expression bore the unmistakable signs of distress as he approached Lord Ashworth with measured steps that seemed to carry the weight of calamity. The whispered conversation that followed sent visible shock-waves through the immediate family, and within moments the carefully orchestrated celebration began to unravel like a poorly stitched seam. The bride had vanished. According to her personal maid, Sarah Mills, Miss Seraphina had been in her dressing chambers until approximately 10:30 that morning. She had been fully attired in her wedding gown, an exquisite creation of ivory silk and Belgian lace that had required 6 months to complete. Her grandmother's diamond tiara had crowned her elaborately arranged auburn hair, and she had appeared, in Sarah's words, calm as a summer morning, though perhaps a touch pale about the lips. But when the time came for the bridal procession, Seraphina Ashworth was nowhere to be found. Her wedding dress lay abandoned upon the Persian carpet of her chambers, the priceless tiara beside it like a fallen crown. The French doors leading to the manor's rose garden stood open, their white silk curtains billowing gently in the autumn breeze. Of the bride herself, there remained not a trace save for a single white rose petal on the window-sill and a peculiar dark smudge upon the door-frame, as if someone wearing gloves had grasped it hastily. The initial assumption, whispered among the guests with barely concealed relish, was that Miss Ashworth had suffered an attack of bridal nerves. Such occurrences, while scandalous, were not entirely unprecedented in society circles. Surely she would return within the hour, embarrassed but unharmed, with some perfectly reasonable explanation for her temporary absence. But as the minutes stretched into an hour, and the hour threatened to become 2, the situation assumed a far more sinister cast. The local constabulary was summoned, much to the horror of both families, who had hoped to resolve the matter with discretion. Inspector Morrison of Scotland Yard, a competent but pedestrian investigator, conducted perfunctory interviews with the household staff and reached the disappointing conclusion that the young lady had simply fled to avoid an unwanted marriage. This explanation satisfied no one and explained nothing. How does a young woman in full wedding regalia simply vanish from a locked room on the second floor of a manor house under the watchful eyes of a dozen servants? Why would she abandon not only her dress and jewels, but also the small leather journal she carried everywhere? A journal that, according to her maid, contained thoughts and observations of a decidedly private nature. It was Sir Reginald himself who suggested consulting a private investigator. "We require," he announced with the authority of a man accustomed to command, "someone with a more sophisticated understanding of human psychology than our good Inspector Morrison can provide." Lady Margaret, despite her distress, retained enough social acumen to make the crucial recommendation. "There is only one man in London," she declared with characteristic decisiveness, "who possesses the necessary delicacy and brilliance for such a matter. A foreign gentleman, to be sure, but his reputation precedes him. His name is Hercule Poirot." The message was dispatched that very evening to a modest flat in Whitehaven Mansions. The reply arrived by return post, written in a precise, almost feminine hand. "Monsieur Poirot will call upon the Ashworth family tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock sharp to examine the scene and interview all concerned parties. He trusts that nothing will be disturbed before his arrival." As night fell over London, the mystery of the vanished bride had already begun to capture the imagination of the press. The evening papers carried headlines ranging from the sensational to the salacious, while society hostesses postponed their dinner parties to dissect every delicious detail of the scandal that would undoubtedly dominate conversation for weeks to come. But within the walls of Ashworth Manor, where the wedding breakfast remained untouched and the flowers wilted in their crystal vases, a more troubling question lingered in the minds of those who knew Seraphina best. Had she vanished of her own free will, or had something far more sinister occurred? And if she had indeed fled, what secrets lay hidden in that mysterious journal that might explain her desperate escape from what appeared to be the perfect marriage? The stage was set for one of London's most baffling mysteries, one that would require all the psychological insight and deductive brilliance of the world's most famous Belgian detective to unravel the truth behind the affair of the bride who vanished before the vows. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Persian carpets of Ashworth Manor's library, where the principal figures in this unfolding drama had assembled like players awaiting their cue. The house, so recently dressed for celebration, now bore the peculiar melancholy of abandoned festivities, white roses drooping in their crystal vases, wedding cake standing untouched in the dining room, and everywhere the oppressive weight of unanswered questions. Inspector Morrison stood before the marble fireplace, his notebook open and his expression betraying the limitations of his pedestrian approach to detection. At 43, he possessed the methodical competence that served well enough for common crimes, but proved woefully inadequate when confronted with the psychological complexities of the upper classes. His neat mustache twitched with barely concealed frustration as he surveyed the assembled company, each of whom seemed to regard him with the polite condescension reserved for tradesmen who had exceeded their proper sphere. "Ladies and gentlemen," Morrison began, clearing his throat with official authority, "until Miss Ashworth is located, I must insist that no one connected with this household depart the premises. This is standard procedure in cases of—" He paused, unwilling to voice the word abduction in such refined company. "In cases of unexplained disappearance." Lord Ashworth paced before the tall windows with the restless energy of a man accustomed to solving problems through decisive action. His textile empire had been built upon his ability to identify patterns and inefficiencies, yet the mystery of his daughter's vanishing defied all logical analysis. The morning papers lay scattered across the mahogany side table, their headlines growing more sensational with each edition, and he could practically feel decades of carefully cultivated respectability crumbling with every passing hour. "Inspector Morrison," he said, his voice carrying the weight of barely controlled anxiety. "Surely you must have some theory to explain how a young woman in full wedding regalia simply vanishes from a locked room on the second floor of my house." Morrison consulted his notebook with the desperate hope of a man seeking salvation in bureaucracy. "The French doors to the garden were found open, my lord. It appears Miss Ashworth may have what?" Sir Reginald Pembroke interrupted from his position near the mantelpiece, his voice sharp with indignation. The prospective bridegroom had aged considerably overnight, his usually immaculate appearance showing signs of strain. His hands, stubbornly gloved despite the informal nature of the gathering, betrayed a slight tremor as he reached for his teacup. "Are you suggesting that my fiancée climbed down from a second-story window in her wedding dress? The notion is preposterous." Captain Charles Pembroke leaned against the bookcase with studied nonchalance, though those who knew him well might have detected something forced in his casual demeanor. At 32, he possessed the dark good looks and romantic temperament that had made him a favorite among London's marriageable daughters, yet this morning his usual charm seemed strained. A faint smear of green marked the polished leather of his shoes, grass, perhaps, or mud from the garden paths. "Perhaps," Charles suggested with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, "we should consider that Seraphina simply changed her mind. It wouldn't be the first time a bride has suffered an attack of nerves." The suggestion hung in the air like an accusation, drawing sharp glances from several quarters. Lady Margaret Ashworth sat rigidly upon the velvet settee, every line of her elegant figure drawn with mathematical precision. Though technically Seraphina's stepmother, she had raised the girl from the age of 7 with a devotion that was both fierce and calculating. Her usual imperious demeanor was softened only slightly by a veneer of maternal concern, yet her sharp eyes missed nothing of the subtle dynamics playing out among the assembled company. "Captain Pembroke," she said with icy politeness, "I must object to any suggestion that my stepdaughter would behave in so thoughtless a manner. Seraphina is not a capricious girl. She understands her obligations." "Precisely what I meant to convey," Sir Reginald added with satisfaction. "Miss Ashworth is an Ashworth. Such behavior would be entirely contrary to her character." From her position near the doorway, Sarah Mills shifted nervously, her red-rimmed eyes darting between the speakers. Seraphina's personal maid had been questioned extensively by Inspector Morrison, yet her account remained frustratingly consistent. Miss Seraphina had been dressed and ready at 10:30, had requested a moment of privacy to write in her journal, and when summoned for the procession, had simply vanished. "Begging your pardon, Sir Reginald," Sarah ventured, her voice barely above a whisper. "But Miss Seraphina did seem different yesterday morning, quieter than usual. She asked me twice about the time, which wasn't like her." "Different how?" Morrison inquired, his pencil poised hopefully. Sarah wrung her hands within her apron. "She kept looking toward the window, sir, and she asked me to fetch her journal from the writing desk, which she'd never done before. Usually kept it close by, she did." Jenkins, the head butler, stepped forward with the measured dignity that 40 years of service had perfected. His weathered face bore the kind of professional composure that could weather any domestic crisis, yet even his practiced demeanor showed signs of strain. "If I may, Inspector," Jenkins said with careful precision, "I conducted a thorough examination of Miss Seraphina's chambers after the discovery. The French doors were indeed unlatched, and there were faint traces of soil on the terrace steps, as if someone had recently brushed against the edge of the flower beds." "Soil?" Morrison looked up sharply. "What sort of soil?" "Dark earth, sir. The kind found in the rose garden below. However," Jenkins paused significantly, "there were no corresponding marks upon Miss Seraphina's wedding slippers, which were found abandoned with her dress." This detail sent a ripple of unease through the assembled company. How does one leave soil traces without leaving footprints? Dr. Greaves, the family physician, had been summoned ostensibly to provide medical expertise, though his primary function seemed to be offering reassurance to Lady Margaret's increasingly fragile composure. His advancing years and discretion had served the Ashworth family through various delicate situations, and his presence suggested that the family feared the worst, though none would voice such dark thoughts aloud. "Inspector," Dr. Greaves interjected gently, "I should mention that I provided Miss Seraphina with a mild sedative the previous evening. Nothing unusual, merely something to help with the natural anxiety of a bride. However, such preparations can occasionally produce unexpected reactions." "What sort of reactions?" Morrison demanded. "Disorientation, perhaps. Impaired judgment, though I must emphasize that the dosage was quite minimal, and Miss Seraphina showed no adverse effects when I examined her that evening." The revelation cast a new shadow over the proceedings, introducing the possibility that Seraphina's disappearance might have been influenced by factors beyond her conscious control. Yet it also raised disturbing questions about the timing and circumstances of her vanishing. "Sir," Reginald's expression darkened considerably. "Dr. Greaves, why was I not informed of this medication? As her intended husband, surely I had a right to know." "The matter was discussed with Lady Margaret," Dr. Greaves replied diplomatically. "It was considered a routine precaution." "Routine?" Charles Pembroke laughed, though the sound held no humor. "Nothing about this situation appears routine, Doctor." The tension in the room had grown palpable, each revelation adding new layers to an already complex puzzle. Inspector Morrison found himself increasingly out of his depth, his methodical approach proving inadequate to navigate the psychological undercurrents that seemed to flow beneath every exchange. It was at this moment that the sound of carriage wheels on gravel announced an arrival that would transform the entire investigation. Through the library windows, they could observe a small, dapper figure emerging from a hansom cab, his movements precise and deliberate as he surveyed the manor's imposing facade with the calculating gaze of a man who missed nothing of significance. Lady Margaret rose from her seat with visible relief. "Gentlemen," she announced with the first genuine confidence she had shown since the crisis began, "our private investigator has arrived. I trust that Monsieur Hercule Poirot will bring clarity to this most distressing situation." The name hung in the air like a promise of revelation, and even Inspector Morrison seemed to straighten slightly, recognizing that he was about to encounter a mind far more sophisticated than his own. Outside, the small Belgian detective stood motionless for a moment, his keen eyes already beginning the process of observation and deduction that would soon illuminate the darkest corners of the mystery surrounding the bride who had vanished before her vows. The stage was set for the entrance of the world's most famous detective, and with him the promise that truth, however uncomfortable, would soon pierce the veil of deception that had fallen over Ashworth Manor. Poirot's entrance and first impressions. The library door opened with theatrical precision, and Hercule Poirot made his entrance with the measured dignity befitting the world's most celebrated private detective. Though barely 5 feet 4 inches in height, his presence commanded immediate attention from every person in the elegantly appointed room. His egg-shaped head, crowned with meticulously waxed black hair, parted with mathematical precision, turned slowly as his pale green eyes conducted their initial survey. The famous moustache, curved upward in defiance of both gravity and English fashion, twitched slightly as he absorbed the psychological atmosphere that hung over the assembled company like morning fog. Every aspect of Poirot's appearance spoke of a man for whom disorder was not merely distasteful but philosophically offensive. His patent leather shoes gleamed with mirror-like perfection, his dark morning coat showed not the slightest wrinkle, and he carried a small ebony cane that served more as an extension of his fastidious personality than as any practical necessity. Before acknowledging the formal introductions that protocol demanded, he moved with deliberate steps to the marble mantelpiece, where a silver-framed photograph sat at a barely perceptible angle. With a deft movement of forefinger and thumb, he adjusted the frame until its base aligned precisely with the carved molding beneath. "Forgive me," Poirot said with a slight bow, his Belgian accent lending musical cadence to his words. "But disorder in small things inevitably reflects disorder in large ones. Now then, I am Hercule Poirot, and I have come at Lady Margaret's gracious invitation to investigate the disappearance of Miss Seraphina Ashworth." Initial psychological assessment. Inspector Morrison stepped forward with the relieved air of a man grateful to share his burden with a more experienced colleague. "Monsieur Poirot, we are indeed grateful for your assistance. The circumstances, as you can imagine, are quite perplexing." "Perplexing, Inspector?" Poirot's eyebrows rose in an expression of polite inquiry. "Or merely awaiting the proper application of method and psychology? Often, what appears mysterious is simply a tangle of overlooked details and misunderstood human nature." His gaze swept the assembled company with the methodical attention of a jeweler examining stones for hidden flaws. "Before I examine the physical evidence, however, I must understand the emotional landscape of this household. Each person present possessed a relationship with Miss Seraphina, and each relationship creates its own pattern of motivation and opportunity." Sir Reginald stepped forward with barely concealed impatience, his gloved hands gripping his walking stick with obvious tension. "Monsieur Poirot, surely the examination of Seraphina's chambers should take precedence over psychological speculation. Every moment we delay increases the danger she may face." Poirot's keen eyes fixed upon the prospective bridegroom with sudden interest. "Ah, but Sir Reginald, you assume Miss Seraphina faces danger, yet you have no evidence of foul play. This assumption reveals something of your own fears, does it not? Perhaps you know of some reason why the young lady might be in peril." The directness of the question sent a visible ripple of discomfort through the room. Sir Reginald's face flushed crimson above his pristine collar. "I merely meant that a young woman alone in London faces countless perils. Any reasonable person would share such concerns." "Indeed," Poirot murmured, making a precise notation in his small leather notebook. "Yet I observe that you wear gloves despite the warmth of the morning, and your walking stick bears traces of garden soil. When did you find occasion to search the grounds, and why do you conceal your hands?" Character revelations through observation. Captain Charles Pembroke laughed with forced lightness, though his dark eyes remained watchful and calculating. "Monsieur Poirot, surely you don't suspect my brother of involvement in Seraphina's disappearance? The suggestion borders on the absurd." "I suspect everyone until I have reason to suspect no one," Poirot replied with mathematical precision. "Captain Pembroke, I note that your shoes also bear traces of damp garden soil, yet the grounds were thoroughly searched yesterday evening. Your constitutional this morning. It occurred before or after your arrival at the manor." Charles's casual demeanor wavered slightly, like a mask slipping at the edges. "I took some air before breakfast. The morning was particularly fine, and stress requires physical outlet." "Stress indeed," Poirot mused. "The stress of a brother's wedding, or perhaps some other concern. The soil upon your shoes is still quite fresh, suggesting your garden visit occurred very recently indeed." Lady Margaret rose from her seat with the dignity of a queen addressing her court, though her voice carried an almost imperceptible tremor. "Monsieur Poirot, while I appreciate the thoroughness of your methods, these interrogations are causing considerable distress to all concerned. We are united in our concern for Seraphina's welfare." "Madame, I understand your distress, but anxiety often reveals truth more clearly than composure," Poirot replied with gentle firmness. "Tell me, what was your impression of Miss Seraphina's state of mind in the days preceding her disappearance?" Lady Margaret's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly, revealing the genuine anguish beneath her social armor. "She was perhaps quieter than usual. The approaching wedding naturally created certain anxieties about her future responsibilities. Her responsibilities? Poirot's eyebrows rose with interest. A curious phrase, madame. It suggests that Miss Seraphina viewed marriage more as a duty than as romantic fulfillment. The maid's crucial testimony. Sarah Mills stepped forward hesitantly, her red-rimmed eyes darting nervously between the assembled company. "If I may, sir," she whispered. Miss Seraphina did seem different that last morning. Not anxious exactly, but determined, like she'd made up her mind about something important. The revelation sent another wave of tension through the room. Poirot made careful notations, his movements deliberate and thoughtful. "Determined," he repeated softly. "Sarah, you have served Miss Seraphina for how long?" 3 years, sir, since she turned 21 and required her own personal maid." "And in those 3 years, had you observed her in such a state of determination before?" Sarah considered the question with obvious care, aware that every eye in the room was fixed upon her. "Only once, sir, when she decided to refuse Lord Pemberton's proposal last spring. She had that same look then, like she'd weighed everything carefully and reached a conclusion that couldn't be changed." The parallel between Seraphina's rejection of a previous suitor and her current disappearance was not lost on anyone present. Sir Reginald's face had grown increasingly pale, while Dr. Greaves shifted uncomfortably, clearly regretting his earlier mention of the sedative he had prescribed. Preparation for investigation. "Most illuminating," Poirot declared, closing his notebook with a decisive snap. "The psychological portrait begins to emerge, but now the physical evidence must either confirm or contradict these impressions. Inspector Morrison, I trust that Miss Seraphina's chambers have been preserved exactly as they were discovered?" "Absolutely, Monsieur Poirot. Nothing has been disturbed on your explicit instructions." "Excellent, for it is in the smallest details, the placement of objects, the pattern of disturbance, the things that are present and those that are absent, that the truth often resides." Poirot moved toward the library door with his characteristic precise gait, then paused to address the assembled company one final time. "I must ask for your complete cooperation and absolute honesty. Each of you holds a piece of this puzzle, whether you realize it or not. My method is not to chase after obvious conclusions, but to delve into the psychology of human behavior, to understand the delicate balance of emotions and motivations that govern our actions. For a mystery such as this is always, at its heart, an intensely human affair." As the small detective moved toward the door, followed by Inspector Morrison and the anxious household, each person present felt the weight of his scrutiny lingering like an uncomfortable memory. The game of detection had begun in earnest, and Hercule Poirot had already begun to weave the threads of observation into the complex tapestry that would ultimately reveal the truth behind the bride who had vanished before her vows. The examination of Seraphina's chambers awaited, and with it the physical evidence that would either support or shatter the psychological theories already forming in the great detective's methodical mind. The physical evidence speaks. Poirot ascended the grand staircase with his characteristic deliberation, each step measured and purposeful as he approached Seraphina Ashworth's chambers. The procession behind him, Inspector Morrison, the anxious family members, and the household staff, followed in respectful silence, aware that they were about to witness the methodical precision that had made the Belgian detective legendary throughout Europe. The bridal chamber itself presented a study in contradictions that immediately captured Poirot's analytical attention. The wedding gown lay upon the Persian carpet with an almost ceremonial arrangement, its ivory silk train spread in perfect symmetry rather than the chaotic abandon one might expect from a panicked flight. The priceless diamond tiara rested beside it with equal precision, placed rather than dropped, suggesting either extraordinary composure or deliberate staging. "Observe, Inspector Morrison," Poirot murmured, producing his small magnifying glass. The manner in which these garments have been arranged. This is not the work of trembling hands or desperate haste. Each fold speaks of careful consideration, as if the bride were performing a ritual rather than fleeing a ceremony. His keen eyes swept the room in systematic arcs, cataloguing every detail with the precision of a master jeweler examining precious stones. The French doors stood open to the rose garden below, their white silk curtains stirring gently in the autumn breeze. Upon the window sill lay a single white rose petal, its edges brown with age, while a dark smudge marked the door frame at shoulder height. Not soil, as initially assumed, but something with an oily consistency that suggested the touch of a gloved hand. Moving to the writing desk positioned beneath the garden window, Poirot discovered the first of several crucial revelations. The leather-bound journal that Sarah Mills had mentioned was conspicuously absent, yet the blotter bore faint impressions of violet ink. With delicate pressure from a pencil held at an oblique angle, he revealed the ghostly outline of hastily written words. South, gate, and what appeared to be 15. Most illuminating, he declared, carefully covering the blotter with his handkerchief. Miss Seraphina wrote something in great haste and then removed it, but the impression remains. Time and location, perhaps, but for what purpose? Dr. Greaves shifted uncomfortably in the doorway, his professional discretion warring with the demands of the investigation. Monsieur Poirot, I feel compelled to mention that the sedative I prescribed for Miss Seraphina might have affected her judgment in unexpected ways. Such medications can occasionally produce a state of heightened emotional clarity, compelling patients to act upon suppressed feelings or decisions. This revelation sent a visible ripple through the assembled company. Sir Reginald's face grew increasingly pale as the implications became clear. His bride might have vanished not through external coercion, but through a chemically induced moment of absolute honesty about their impending marriage. Poirot's examination of the silver-backed hairbrush upon the dressing table yielded another significant discovery. Among Seraphina's characteristic auburn strands, he found several darker hairs that seemed inconsistent with her coloring. Inspector Morrison, he observed with quiet satisfaction, you noted these additional hair samples in your initial examination. Morrison's embarrassed silence provided its own answer, prompting Poirot to make careful notations about the oversight. Such details, he knew, often proved crucial to understanding the human drama that lay beneath the surface of any mystery. The detective's methodical investigation was interrupted by the arrival of a breathless constable bearing what appeared to be the solution to their puzzle. Inspector, we've found a note from Miss Ashworth. Down by the south gate, tucked under a loose stone. Morrison's face brightened with triumphant relief as he read the crumpled message aloud. Forgive me, Papa. I cannot go through with this. My heart belongs elsewhere. Do not search for me. S. There you have it, Morrison declared with obvious satisfaction. She's eloped with someone, probably that young artist, Alistair Finch, who was known to be quite smitten with her. But Poirot received this apparent breakthrough with characteristic skepticism, his pale green eyes studying the note with microscopic attention. A most convenient discovery, Inspector, and perfectly aligned with the most obvious explanation. Yet observe the inconsistencies. Formal address followed by informal signature, common ledger paper rather than personal stationery, and the remarkably generic sentiments for such a dramatic decision. He gestured toward the abandoned wedding dress and missing journal. Why would a bride fleeing for love abandon priceless garments yet take only her private writings? And why leave such an important message under a remote stone rather than ensuring its direct delivery to her family? The false lead was perfectly constructed to satisfy those who preferred simple solutions, but Poirot's little grey cells detected the careful orchestration behind its placement. No, Inspector, he concluded with quiet certainty. This note cries out for further scrutiny. The truth, she is rarely so obliging as to present herself so conveniently, particularly in such dramatic circumstances. As the small detective prepared to conduct his individual interviews with the suspects, it was clear that the mystery of the vanished bride had only deepened. The physical evidence spoke of careful planning and deliberate misdirection, while the psychological landscape revealed layers of motivation and deception that would require all of Poirot's legendary analytical powers to unravel. The game, as he well knew, was only beginning. The first false lead and methodical interviews. Hercule Poirot established his temporary headquarters in the Manor's intimate morning room, a space whose gentle proportions and ordered arrangement appealed to his methodical nature. With characteristic precision, he adjusted 2 chairs so they faced each other without confrontation, opened the tall window exactly 3 inches to ensure proper ventilation, and placed his ebony walking stick parallel to the table's edge. Only when every detail met his exacting standards did he signal for Inspector Morrison to join him. The inspector entered with barely concealed triumph, brandishing the crumpled note like a banner of victory. "Monsieur Poirot, I believe we have our solution. Miss Ashworth has clearly eloped with that artist fellow, Alistair Finch. The evidence speaks for itself. The note, the open French doors, the fact that Finch himself has vanished from his lodgings in the village." Poirot received this announcement with the patient attention of a professor listening to a promising but flawed student presentation. His pale green eyes studied the note with microscopic care, noting every detail of paper quality, ink consistency, and handwriting characteristics. "Inspector Morrison," he said with gentle authority, "you accept that a young lady of Miss Seraphina's refinement would abandon priceless garments and family jewels to leave such a generic message under a remote stone. Consider the inconsistencies. Formal address followed by informal signature, common ledger paper rather than her customary fine stationery, and remarkably conventional sentiments for such a dramatic decision." The detective's methodical deconstruction of the apparent evidence sent visible unease through the assembled family members. Furthermore, the impressions on her writing desk blotter spoke of specific timing and location: Southgate and 15. This suggests a planned rendezvous, yet if she were eloping for love, why abandon her private journal, which according to her maid contained thoughts and observations of the most intimate nature? Inspector Morrison's confidence wavered under this logical assault. "But surely, Monsieur Poirot, the simplest explanation, my friend, is often the most carefully constructed deception," Poirot replied with quiet certainty. "Someone wishes us to believe in this romantic flight, but the evidence cries out against such convenient conclusions. Now, if you please, I must conduct individual interviews to understand the psychological landscape of this household." Sarah Mills entered the morning room with the timid steps of one expecting reprimand, but finding gentle inquiry instead. Poirot gestured to the prepared chair with courteous authority, his manner designed to encourage confidence rather than intimidation. "Mademoiselle Sarah," he began, his Belgian accent lending musical cadence to his words, "you fetched Miss Seraphina's journal yesterday morning. Describe it to me as if you were telling a blind man." "It was small, sir," Sarah replied, her voice gaining strength under Poirot's encouraging gaze. "Brown calfskin with a little brass clasp. The pages were edged in gold, and Miss Seraphina always used violet ink, French ink that she bought herself from Harrods." "Violet ink, précisément," Poirot murmured, recalling the faint impressions on the blotter. "You brought it to her at what time?" 10:20, sir. She'd already had her hair done and the veil fixed. She asked me for 5 minutes alone. Said she wanted to write something private before the ceremony. I went to fetch orange flower water for her wrists. She always dabbed a little when she felt anxious. And when I returned at 10:30, the French doors were open and her dress was on the floor. This testimony established a crucial timeline that would prove significant to Poirot's developing theory. Had anyone besides yourself and Miss Seraphina entered her chambers that morning? Sarah's brow furrowed with concentration. Lady Margaret came just after 9 to check the final alterations. Dr. Greaves arrived at 9:15 to leave a sedative in case she needed it. And Captain Pembroke brought a small parcel around 10 o'clock. Said it was a wedding gift from him and Sir Reginald. Poirot's eyebrows rose with sudden interest. A parcel? Describe it, if you please. A little box tied with blue ribbon, sir. Captain Pembroke said it contained a charm for her bouquet. Something nautical, I think. He didn't stay long, just placed it on her dressing table and said he'd see Miss Seraphina downstairs. The revelation of this previously unmentioned gift added another layer to the mystery's complexity. Poirot made precise notations before continuing his methodical questioning. The hairbrush on Miss Seraphina's dressing table. You maintain it in perfect condition. Every night, sir. Miss Seraphina despises untidiness of any sort. Then the darker hairs I observed among her auburn strands. They were not present when you cleaned the brush last evening. Sarah's pause carried the weight of certainty. No, sir, they were definitely not there. Jenkins presented himself next with the polished composure that 40 years of distinguished service had perfected. His responses carried the methodical precision that Poirot found both admirable and informative. The south gate, Monsieur Poirot, remains locked at all times, the butler explained with professional authority. I hold one key, the head gardener possesses another, and a third resides in the estate office safe. Lord Ashworth carries a master key to all exterior gates. Yesterday morning, which keys were in active use? Mine remained in my pocket throughout the morning. The gardener's key was with him as he pruned the espalier pears near the east wall until noon. The safe key remained secure. Mrs. Keene and I verified this when the police arrived. This information created a crucial logical constraint that undermined the elopement theory. And when the constable discovered the note, was the gate found locked or unlocked? Locked, sir. The paper was tucked under a loose stone on the inside of the fence, accessible through the iron bars without requiring a key. Poirot nodded with satisfaction. So one could place such a message without possessing access to the gate itself. Most illuminating. Tell me, who ventured into the gardens between 10 and 11 yesterday morning? Jenkins consulted his mental catalogue with butler-like precision. The gardeners, naturally. Miss Seraphina's maid once, briefly. Captain Pembroke took air around 10:50. Sir Reginald went out immediately after 11 had passed, remaining outside for approximately 15 minutes before returning via the terrace. The systematic interviews continued with Sir Reginald, whose persistent wearing of gloves, despite the morning's warmth, had not escaped Poirot's observant eye. When the detective politely requested to examine the baronet's hands, he discovered a shallow abrasion at the base of the thumb and traces of dark substance near the cuff. If you must know the truth, Sir Reginald admitted with obvious irritation, I spent yesterday afternoon at the motor garage, overseeing preparations for our wedding journey. My hands are unaccustomed to such practical matters. Your walking stick also bears traces of garden soil, Poirot observed mildly. I searched the grounds as any concerned bridegroom would, Sir Reginald replied curtly. Must I justify my distress to you? Captain Charles Pembroke's interview revealed layers of complexity beneath his carefully cultivated charm. His explanation for the morning garden walk seemed plausible enough, nervous energy requiring outlet. Yet Poirot detected subtle inconsistencies in his manner. The parcel you delivered to Miss Seraphina, Poirot inquired with deceptive casualness, contained what sort of nautical charm? A silver ship's wheel, Charles replied readily. A jest between brothers. Reginald's world revolves around maritime commerce, so I thought it appropriate. Did it cause offence? Not at all, but the timing interests me. Why deliver it precisely at 10 o'clock? Charles's practiced smile faltered slightly. I had meant to present it at breakfast, but forgot in the morning's excitement. You understand how such occasions can scramble one's usual routines. Lady Margaret's interview proved the most psychologically complex, revealing the intricate dynamics between stepmother and stepdaughter that had shaped Seraphina's development. Her responses carried the careful calculation of a woman who had spent years navigating society's expectations while managing a headstrong young woman's romantic inclinations. I raised Seraphina to understand her obligations, Lady Margaret explained with rigid composure. The marriage to Sir Reginald represents the culmination of years of careful preparation for her proper place in society. Yet preparation for happiness or for duty, madame? Poirot inquired with gentle persistence. The distinction struck Lady Margaret with unexpected force, her carefully maintained facade cracking to reveal genuine maternal anguish beneath the social armor. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the morning room's ordered space, Poirot had accumulated a wealth of psychological insights and concrete evidence. Each interview had revealed another thread in the complex web of relationships, motivations, and opportunities that surrounded Seraphina's disappearance. The methodical detective closed his notebook with characteristic precision, his mind already beginning to weave the various testimonies into patterns that would ultimately reveal the truth. The psychological landscape of the Ashworth household proved far more treacherous than its elegant facade suggested, and the planted note that had initially seemed to solve the mystery now appeared as merely the first layer of a carefully constructed deception. Inspector Morrison waited expectantly for Poirot's conclusions, but the Belgian detective merely smiled with enigmatic satisfaction. "We have, mon ami, a note which is convenient, a gate which remains locked, a journal that walks away, hairs that do not belong, gloves that conceal, and a charm that arrives precisely when precision fails. You will say this is confusion, but I tell you it is design." "Design toward what end?" Morrison asked with growing unease. "Toward a picture that is almost complete," Poirot replied softly, his pale green eyes gleaming with the intellectual satisfaction of a puzzle nearing solution. "It lacks only a few more strokes of the brush and a proper frame. The first false lead has been laid to send us chasing shadows, but Hercule Poirot does not follow red herrings. He follows the little grey cells, and they tell him that this fish, she smells very rotten indeed." The stage was set for the next phase of his investigation, where the psychological insights gathered through methodical questioning would combine with physical evidence to illuminate the truth behind the carefully orchestrated disappearance of the bride who had vanished before her vow. The psychological game intensifies. The conservatory at Ashworth Manor provided the perfect stage for Hercule Poirot's next calculated movement in the intricate chess game of detection. With its symmetrical arrangement of palms and pristine white-tiled paths, the glass-walled sanctuary offered both intimacy and transparency, qualities the Belgian detective required for the delicate psychological surgery he was about to perform. He arranged the space with characteristic precision. 2 chairs positioned at precisely the correct angle to encourage confidence while maintaining subtle pressure, a small mahogany table between them bearing the abandoned bridal bouquet, and the crucial addition of Sarah's vial of orange flower water, fetched specifically for its psychological significance. Poirot's methodical approach began with a seemingly casual request that would prove devastatingly effective. He asked Jenkins to retrieve the estate ledger from the office safe, ostensibly to verify the timeline of yesterday's events. When Mrs. Keene, the formidable housekeeper whose iron composure had weathered decades of domestic crises, produced the heavy leather-bound volume, Poirot's keen eyes immediately detected what others had overlooked. "Observe, Inspector Morrison," he murmured, turning the pages with surgical precision. "A leaf is missing from this ledger. The paper she has been torn out with great care, leaving only the faintest trace along the binding." His pale green eyes gleamed with intellectual satisfaction as he produced the crumpled note allegedly written by Seraphina. The paper of this ledger and our convenient farewell message, they share what one might call a family resemblance. The revelation struck the assembled company like a physical blow. Inspector Morrison's face flushed with embarrassment at having accepted such obvious evidence without proper scrutiny, while the family members exchanged glances heavy with unspoken implications. Someone within the household had deliberately forged the elopement note, using materials readily available within the manor itself. The detective's individual interviews began with Sir Reginald, summoned to the conservatory under the pretense of clarifying timeline details. Poirot's approach combined apparent casualness with laser-focused observation, noting every micro-expression and unconscious gesture that might reveal hidden truths. "Sir Reginald," Poirot began with deceptive gentleness, offering the wilted bridal bouquet. If Miss Seraphina had truly wished to communicate her intentions before the ceremony, what manner of message would she have written? Speak as she would have expressed herself. The prospective bridegroom handled the flowers awkwardly, his gloved hands trembling slightly as he considered the question. "She would have acknowledged her duty," he replied with forced conviction. Seraphina understood her obligations to both families. She would never have caused such public humiliation without extraordinary circumstances. "And yet," Poirot observed with characteristic precision, "you continue to wear gloves despite the morning's warmth, and beneath the cuff I detect traces of what appears to be motor oil. Your explanation of garage visits seems comprehensive for such a refined gentleman's typical activities." The psychological pressure was expertly calibrated, designed not to elicit immediate confession, but to plant seeds of anxiety that would grow and ultimately bear fruit. Sir Reginald's visible discomfort confirmed that Poirot had identified a significant inconsistency in his carefully constructed alibi. Captain Charles Pembroke's interview revealed even more intriguing psychological dynamics. The younger brother entered the conservatory with studied nonchalance, but his sharp eyes immediately noted and corrected a deliberately misaligned chair, a reaction that spoke volumes about his own need for control and precision. "Captain Pembroke," Poirot observed with apparent admiration, "you share my distaste for disorder. We are kindred spirits in that regard. The wedding gift you delivered at precisely 10 o'clock, a silver ship's wheel, symbolizing how a brother's world revolves around maritime success. Yet this thoughtful present has mysteriously vanished from Miss Seraphina's chambers. Most vexing for a man who clearly chooses his moments with such care." Charles' practiced smile faltered slightly under the detective's penetrating gaze. "I hardly planned the timing with military precision, Monsieur Poirot. The morning's excitement scrambled everyone's usual routines." "Indeed," Poirot murmured, making precise notations. "Yet your admiration for Miss Seraphina extends beyond mere brotherly affection, does it not? Love, Captain, does not speak in generalities. It declares itself with singular passion." The detective's interview with Lady Margaret proved particularly revealing as he introduced the psychological element of scent memory. Uncorking Sarah's vial of orange flower water with ceremonial precision, he allowed the delicate fragrance to permeate the conservatory's warm air. "Madame," he said softly, "this scent recalls Miss Seraphina to your memory, does it not? You introduced her to this particular preference, taught her its calming properties for moments of anxiety." Lady Margaret's carefully maintained composure cracked visibly, her elegant facade revealing genuine maternal anguish beneath. It steadied her nerves during difficult moments. "I thought it might help with the natural anxiety of a bride." "And yet," Poirot continued with gentle persistence, "yesterday morning the head gardener detected this same fragrance near the south gate, carried on empty air where no lady had walked. Someone wished to create the impression of Miss Seraphina's presence in that location." Dr. Greaves's interview introduced the crucial element of the sedative's potential misuse. The elderly physician's professional discretion warred visibly with the demands of the investigation as Poirot pressed him about the labeled medication bottle. "Doctor, your prescription was clearly marked with dosage instructions, was it not?" Such clarity, while medically responsible, might invite creative interpretation by someone seeking to enhance its effects. The implication that the sedative might have been tampered with sent another wave of unease through the household, adding yet another layer to the increasingly complex web of deception surrounding Seraphina's disappearance. The psychological seeds that Poirot had so carefully planted began to germinate almost immediately. The telephone's shrill ring interrupted the tense atmosphere, bringing news that would transform the entire investigation. Jenkins answered with his characteristic composure, but his weathered features showed visible alarm as he received the message. "A communication from the village post office," the butler reported quietly. "A parcel addressed to Miss Seraphina Ashworth was delivered this morning, requiring a signature. At 11:40, a gentleman claimed it, tall, dark-haired, with military bearing. The clerk noted that he wore gloves. The timing was devastatingly significant. 11:40 placed the mysterious gentleman's appearance at the post office well after Seraphina's disappearance had been discovered, yet someone had possessed both the knowledge of the parcel's arrival and the authority to claim it in her name. Poirot's pale green eyes gleamed with intellectual satisfaction as the pattern began to emerge with mathematical clarity. "Inspector Morrison," he said softly, "we begin to see the careful orchestration behind these seemingly random events. Someone has been playing a most elaborate game of misdirection." Before he could elaborate further, a piercing scream from the floor above shattered the conservatory's contemplative atmosphere. Sarah Mills's voice, strangled with horror, echoed through the manor's elegant corridors. "In her room, oh God, her veil—" The assembled company rushed toward the staircase with undignified haste, Poirot among them, though maintaining his characteristic composure even in crisis. In Seraphina's chambers, they discovered a scene of carefully staged drama. The wedding veil lay torn upon the neatly made bed, its delicate lace shredded as if by many careful hands. The air was heavy with orange flower water, applied far too liberally to be natural. Upon the pillow rested an envelope addressed in unfamiliar handwriting. "To those who search." The theatrical presentation was unmistakable. Someone was attempting to control the investigation's direction through dramatic revelation, rather than allowing Poirot's methodical approach to uncover the truth naturally. "Inspector," Poirot said quietly, his voice cutting through the shocked exclamations of the assembled company, "you observe how our mysterious correspondent prefers grand gestures to subtle communication. Drama often masks fear of discovery, and I suspect this latest development is designed to distract us from more significant evidence." As the household gathered around the ominous envelope, Poirot noted with professional interest how each suspect reacted to this new development. Lady Margaret braced herself against the bedpost with visible distress. Sir Reginald reached instinctively for his ever-present gloves, and Captain Charles' eyes went not to the torn veil, but to the dressing table, as if seeking confirmation that something specific remained absent. The psychological game had intensified dramatically, but Hercule Poirot recognized the desperation behind such theatrical gestures. Someone was feeling the pressure of his methodical investigation and had chosen to escalate the stakes, rather than allow the truth to emerge through patient deduction. The stage was set for the next crucial phase of the investigation, where the seeds of suspicion and anxiety that Poirot had so carefully planted would either bloom into confession or drive the guilty party to make the fatal error that would expose their carefully constructed deception. The bride who had vanished before her vows remained missing, but the web of lies surrounding her disappearance was beginning to unravel under the relentless pressure of the world's most famous detective's psychological warfare. The envelope waited on the pillow like a challenge, but Poirot knew that true revelation would come not from theatrical gestures, but from the methodical application of logic, psychology, and his legendary little grey cells to the human drama unfolding within the elegant walls of Ashworth Manor. The envelope's dark contents. The envelope lay upon Seraphina's pillow like a theatrical prop awaiting its cue, and Hercule Poirot approached it with the methodical precision that had made him legendary throughout Europe. With his small penknife, he slit the flap cleanly, noting the faint aroma that escaped. Not orange flower water, but something sharper and more masculine. Bay rum, perhaps, the kind favoured by gentlemen who frequented the better barber shops of London. The contents proved as dramatically staged as Poirot had anticipated. A small silver charm fell first, a ship's wheel threaded with white ribbon, followed by a narrow strip of paper bearing 2 words in violet ink: Wrong Harbour. The collective intake of breath from the assembled company was audible, and Poirot observed with professional interest how each suspect reacted to this revelation. Captain Charles Pembroke took an involuntary step forward before checking himself with visible effort, his face draining of colour as he recognized the charm he had delivered that morning. Sir Reginald's mouth tightened over his teeth, while Lady Margaret's hand flew instinctively to her throat in a gesture of barely controlled panic. "The gift you delivered at 10 o'clock, Captain," Poirot observed mildly, lifting the charm by its ribbon between forefinger and thumb. "It makes, n'est-ce pas, a very dramatic reappearance, and with an inscription that was not present when you left it upon Miss Seraphina's dressing table." The detective's keen eyes had immediately detected the tiny scratches on the charm's reverse side, initials nearly invisible to casual observation: C to S. "Sentiment expressed with economy," he murmured, yet revealing in its intimacy. "Captain Pembroke, your admiration for Miss Seraphina extends beyond mere brotherly affection, does it not?" Charles's practiced composure cracked visibly under this direct assault. "That is preposterous," he burst out. "I left it on Seraphina's dressing table, as I said. I have not been near this room since." The phrase "wrong harbour" has the quality of a taunt, not a farewell, Poirot continued with relentless logic. It suggests navigation toward an unintended destination, perhaps a metaphor for misplaced affections or misdirected loyalties. Before the psychological pressure could intensify further, Jenkins appeared in the doorway with news that would transform the investigation once again. "Monsieur Poirot," the butler reported with barely controlled urgency, "Mr. Cobb, the head gardener, has been found unconscious by the south wall. He appears to have been struck, and his gate key is missing." The procession to the garden revealed a scene of calculated violence that spoke of desperation rather than random crime. Mr. Cobb lay beside the espalier pears, his grey hair matted with blood from a shallow but effective blow. Dr. Greaves's examination confirmed that while the injury was not life-threatening, it had been precisely administered to incapacitate rather than kill. Poirot's methodical examination of the scene yielded several crucial pieces of evidence. The disturbed gravel showed a narrow arc where someone had slipped, and a single boot print bore the distinctive half-moon metal edge common to military footwear. Beyond, in the cinder path leading to the sunken lane, tire marks told their own story, 2 narrow, close-set tracks with a third slightly offset. "A motorcycle with sidecar," Inspector Morrison declared with growing excitement. "The gentleman at the post office with military bearing, it all fits together." But Poirot's attention had been captured by a small curved splinter of black enamel paint, no larger than a fingernail, which he carefully preserved in his handkerchief. "It fits like a glove that may yet be the wrong size," he murmured, his pale green eyes gleaming with intellectual satisfaction. When Mr. Cobb regained consciousness, his testimony added another crucial element to the puzzle. "Came to ask about opening the gate for carriages," he muttered thickly. "Some fellow standing behind the pear tree. Smelt like the barber's shop. Next thing I knew, stars dancing before my eyes." The scent of bay rum connected this assault directly to the envelope's mysterious aroma, suggesting that whoever had orchestrated Seraphina's disappearance was now taking increasingly desperate measures to control the investigation. The theft of the gate key indicated not past crimes, but future plans. Someone needed access to the south lane for purposes yet to be revealed. The investigation's momentum accelerated when a breathless constable arrived with news that would provide the day's most shocking revelation. "Inspector Morrison, sir. We've found Alistair Finch in his lodgings, barely alive from gas poisoning. There's a note on his table. Something about 'forgive me' and Miss Ashworth." The apparent suicide attempt of the young artist, whom gossip had linked romantically to Seraphina, sent fresh shockwaves through the assembled company. Inspector Morrison immediately declared the case solved. Clearly, Finch had abducted the bride in a moment of passionate desperation and now sought to escape justice through self-destruction. But Poirot received this convenient resolution with characteristic skepticism. "Inspector Morrison," he said quietly, "remember that the guilty man does not write notes to absolve us of labor. He writes to arrange our thoughts along his chosen route. Wrong harbor. Change of course. A sidecar convenient to a south lane. A key stolen not for yesterday's crimes, but for today's plans." The detective's methodical deconstruction of the apparent evidence revealed the careful orchestration behind each dramatic revelation. Someone was conducting the investigation like a symphony, introducing themes precisely when they would have maximum psychological impact while directing attention away from more significant truths. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across Ashworth Manor's elegant grounds, Poirot gathered his observations with the satisfaction of a chess master approaching checkmate. The ship's wheel charm with its intimate inscription, the assault timed to provide access for future activities, the convenient discovery of Finch's apparent guilt, all served to obscure a more complex truth involving medical knowledge, careful timing, and psychological manipulation. The stage was set for the next crucial phase of the investigation, where the seeds of suspicion that Poirot had so carefully planted would either bloom into confession or drive the guilty party to make the fatal error that would expose their elaborate deception. The bride who had vanished before her vows remained missing, but the web of lies surrounding her disappearance was beginning to unravel under the relentless pressure of the world's most famous detective's methodical approach to human psychology and criminal behavior. The little gray cells were working at full capacity, and Hercule Poirot was ready to spring the trap that would finally illuminate the truth behind this most carefully orchestrated of mysteries. The investigation deepens. The journey to Alistair Finch's modest lodgings in Bloomsbury took precisely 23 minutes by hansom cab, during which Hercule Poirot sat in contemplative silence, his pale green eyes half closed as his legendary little grey cells processed the accumulating evidence. Inspector Morrison fidgeted with barely concealed impatience, convinced that the young artist's apparent suicide attempt would provide the convenient resolution that had thus far eluded their investigation. The landlady, Mrs. Pemberton, led them up narrow stairs with the resigned air of one accustomed to her tenant's eccentricities. "Quiet as a church mouse since yesterday afternoon," she muttered, producing a brass key from her apron. "Paid his rent regular, never caused trouble, though he did have some peculiar visitors. Lately, gentlemen in fine clothes asking questions about his painting commissions." The acrid smell of gas greeted them even before the door opened, though someone had been thoughtful enough to raise a window precisely 2 inches. Not enough to prevent poisoning, but sufficient to create ambiguity about intent. Alistair Finch lay upon a threadbare chaise longue near the casement, his youthful features grey with carbon monoxide poisoning, breathing shallowly but steadily. Poirot's methodical examination of the scene revealed the same careful orchestration that had characterized every aspect of this case. The gas tap had been wrenched open with brutal efficiency, yet a delicate handkerchief clutched in Finch's limp fingers bore the unmistakable scent of bay rum rather than the orange flower water one might expect from a lovesick young man. Upon the writing table, a suicide note written in violet ink proclaimed, "Forgive me, I'm a coward, S.A. Again, Poirot murmured, examining the ink bottle with his magnifying glass. The barber's shop walks where it has no business. Observe, Inspector, this bottle has been recently opened, the cork unstained except at a single edge. One message only has been written with this ink, yet where is the pen? And see here, upon the mantelpiece, another trace of orange flower water applied with the heavy hand of deception rather than the delicate touch of genuine sentiment. Dr. Greaves, summoned by telephone, pronounced that Finch would survive if removed immediately to hospital. As the unconscious artist was being prepared for transport, Poirot bent close to his ear, with the gentle persistence that had extracted confessions from the most hardened criminals. "Monsieur Finch," he whispered, his Belgian accent lending musical urgency to the words, "who brought the bottle of ink?" The young man's eyelids fluttered, his lips moving with desperate effort. "Not her journal, blue ribbon." The words emerged as barely audible breath before he lapsed back into unconsciousness. Poirot's keen eyes immediately began a systematic search of the cramped lodgings. Behind the iron grate, wrapped in yesterday's newspaper, lay a small calfskin journal with brass clasp and gold-edged pages, unmistakably Seraphina's private diary. The clasp had been broken with considerable force, and a frayed blue ribbon marked the center pages. "This journal, Inspector Morrison, has resided here for some hours. Observe the undisturbed dust upon the outer leaves. It did not travel yesterday to these lodgings in Miss Seraphina's possession, but was brought by another hand, seeking to create the impression of romantic conspiracy." The detective's examination of the journal's contents would have to wait for more private circumstances, but its very presence confirmed his growing suspicion that every piece of apparent evidence had been carefully planted to support a predetermined narrative. Someone with intimate knowledge of both Seraphina's habits and Finch's circumstances had orchestrated this elaborate deception with theatrical precision. Returning to Ashworth Manor as afternoon shadows lengthened across the elegant grounds, Poirot established himself in the conservatory with the methodical precision that had made him legendary throughout Europe. He arranged his evidence upon the mahogany table like a master jeweler displaying precious stones. The forged note with its telltale ledger paper, the ship's wheel charm bearing its intimate inscription, the splinter of black enamel paint, and most significantly, the recovered journal that would undoubtedly reveal crucial insights into Seraphina's state of mind. The detective's pale green eyes gleamed with intellectual satisfaction as patterns began to emerge with mathematical clarity. Each piece of evidence had been designed to support the narrative of either romantic elopement or tragic suicide, yet the very perfection of this narrative betrayed its artificial construction. Real human behavior, Poirot knew, was never so conveniently dramatic or symbolically neat. The bay rum scent that connected the envelope in Seraphina's chamber, the assault on Mr. Cobb, and now Finch's staged suicide suggested a single orchestrating mind, someone whose personal grooming habits had become an unwitting signature. The orange flower water, applied too liberally at multiple locations, spoke of someone attempting to create sensory evidence of Seraphina's presence where she had never been. Most telling of all was the psychological sophistication required to construct such an elaborate deception. This was not the desperate improvisation of a panicked criminal, but the calculated manipulation of someone who understood both human psychology and police procedure well enough to anticipate and misdirect official investigation. As evening approached, Poirot made his preparations with characteristic thoroughness. He dispatched careful instructions to Inspector Morrison regarding surveillance of the South Gate and the mysterious St. Jude's boathouse mentioned by the captured motorcyclist. More importantly, he began to lay the psychological traps that would ultimately force the guilty party to reveal themselves through their own desperate actions. The hidden clue that had eluded everyone else was becoming clear to Poirot's methodical mind. It was not a single piece of physical evidence, but rather the very nature of the deception itself. The elaborate theatrical elements, the precise timing of each misdirection, the careful planting of evidence, all spoke of a mind determined to control not just events, but their interpretation. Someone had not merely caused Serafina to vanish, but had orchestrated an entire narrative to explain her disappearance in terms that would prevent effective investigation. The question that remained was whether this elaborate deception served to conceal a crime of passion, a calculated abduction, or something far more sinister. As night fell over London, Hercule Poirot sat alone in the conservatory, his fingers steepled before him in an attitude of profound concentration. The little grey cells were working at full capacity, weaving together threads of evidence, motivation, and human psychology into a tapestry that would soon reveal the complete truth behind the affair of the bride who had vanished before her vows. The stage was set for the final confrontation, but first, the guilty party would be given one last opportunity to reveal themselves through their own desperate attempts to maintain control over a deception that was already beginning to crumble under the relentless pressure of methodical investigation. The hidden clue had been found, and with it, the key to unraveling one of the most psychologically complex crimes that even Hercule Poirot had ever encountered. Tomorrow would bring the final gathering, where truth would finally triumph over the most carefully constructed lies, and justice would be served with the precision and elegance that had made the Belgian detective the most feared adversary of criminals throughout the civilized world. The hidden clue emerges. The grandfather clock in Ashworth Manor's entrance hall had just chimed 11 when Hercule Poirot made his final preparations for what he knew would be the most crucial night of the investigation. The Belgian detective moved through the darkened corridors with characteristic precision, his small figure casting deliberate shadows as he positioned himself in the morning room where Serafina's recovered journal lay open beneath the lamplight like bait in an elaborate trap. The psychological architecture of the crime had finally revealed itself to Poirot's methodical mind. Throughout the evening, he had studied the journal's entries with microscopic attention, noting not merely their content, but the subtle variations in handwriting pressure, ink flow, and emotional intensity that told their own story. The final entries, written in the days before the wedding, revealed a young woman of fierce intelligence who had discovered something that made her planned marriage not merely distasteful, but morally impossible. October 12th, one entry read in Serafina's characteristic violet ink. I can no longer pretend ignorance of what I have learned. The marriage cannot proceed, yet the truth would destroy more than my own happiness. There must be another way. One that preserves what can be preserved while preventing what must be prevented. The detective had also made a crucial discovery about the pattern of evidence itself. Every piece of apparent proof, the forged note, the planted charm, the staged suicide attempt, the assault on Mr. Cobb, had been designed not merely to mislead, but to create a specific narrative that would satisfy official investigation without requiring deeper scrutiny. This was not the desperate improvisation of a panicked criminal, but the methodical orchestration of someone who understood both human psychology and police procedure with sophisticated precision. More significantly, Poirot had identified the hidden clue that had eluded everyone else. The very theatricality of the deceptions revealed their author. Someone with intimate knowledge of the Ashworth household, medical expertise, access to the family's private papers, and a motive compelling enough to justify such elaborate manipulation, had been conducting the investigation like a symphony, introducing themes precisely when they would have maximum psychological impact. As midnight approached, the trap that Poirot had so carefully prepared began to spring. A soft footfall in the corridor outside the morning room announced the arrival of someone drawn by the sight of the journal beneath the lamplight. The door handle turned with exquisite care, and a gloved hand appeared in the doorway, not reaching for the journal, but testing whether the room was truly unguarded. The detective remained motionless in his concealment behind the heavy velvet curtains, his pale green eyes observing every detail of the intruder's behavior. The figure withdrew without entering, but not before Poirot had noted the distinctive aroma of bay rum cologne and the particular way the gloved hand gripped the doorframe, with the practiced steadiness of someone accustomed to performing delicate medical procedures. 10 minutes later, the carefully orchestrated finale began. From the estate office came the acrid smell of smoke and Jenkins's alarmed cry of "Fire!" The blaze, when they reached it, proved to be small but strategically placed, designed to destroy the remaining pages of the estate ledger while creating sufficient distraction for other activities. Among the charred papers, Poirot discovered fragments that confirmed his growing suspicions about the forged farewell note. But the most significant discovery came when he examined the window through which the arsonist had gained entry. Embedded in the frame was another splinter of black enamel paint, identical to those found at previous crime scenes. More importantly, the sill bore traces of a distinctive medical soap, the kind used by physicians who must maintain absolute cleanliness in their professional duties. The pattern was now complete, and Poirot's little grey cells had assembled the final pieces of the puzzle. The elaborate deceptions, the medical knowledge required for the staged suicide attempt, the intimate familiarity with family dynamics, the access to sedatives and medical supplies, all pointed to someone whose professional position had provided both opportunity and method for the most sophisticated criminal manipulation the detective had ever encountered. As dawn broke over London, casting pale light through the Manor's tall windows, Poirot prepared for the final gathering that would expose the truth behind the bride who had vanished before her vows. The hidden clue was no longer hidden, and the careful psychological pressure he had applied over the past 3 days was about to yield its inevitable result. The stage was set for justice to be served with the precision and elegance that had made Hercule Poirot the most feared adversary of criminals throughout the civilized world. The pattern of deception that had seemed so cleverly constructed would soon be revealed as the very evidence that condemned its architect, and the truth would finally triumph over even the most sophisticated lies. In his small leather notebook, Poirot made one final entry. The hidden clue in any crime of psychological manipulation is always the psychology of the manipulator himself. The mind that creates elaborate deceptions invariably reveals itself through the very sophistication of its methods. Tomorrow, all will be made clear. The morning light grew stronger, and with it came the promise that the mystery of Seraphina Ashworth's disappearance would finally be solved through the methodical application of logic, psychology, and the legendary analytical powers of the world's most famous detective. The final gathering. Truth revealed. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Ashworth Manor's drawing room as Hercule Poirot made his final preparations for what he knew would be the most crucial confrontation of the investigation. With characteristic precision, he arranged the chairs in a perfect semicircle, adjusted the silver-framed photographs until they aligned with mathematical exactitude, and placed his carefully selected evidence upon the mahogany table like a master jeweler displaying precious stones. The assembled company took their places with the tense anticipation of those who knew that carefully guarded secrets were about to be exposed. Lord and Lady Ashworth sat rigidly upright, their faces bearing the strain of 3 days of uncertainty. Sir Reginald occupied his chair with visible discomfort, his gloved hands gripping his walking stick with white-knuckled intensity. Captain Charles Pembroke maintained his practiced composure, though his dark eyes remained watchful and calculating. Dr. Greaves folded his hands with professional dignity, while Inspector Morrison prepared his notebook with the eager attention of a student awaiting enlightenment. "Ladies and gentlemen," Poirot began, his Belgian accent lending musical authority to his words, "we gather not to witness the resolution of a simple disappearance, but to observe the unraveling of the most sophisticated criminal deception I have encountered in my career. For 3 days, we have been presented with a carefully orchestrated theatrical production, each scene designed to lead us along a predetermined path of investigation. The detective moved to his evidence table with deliberate precision, lifting the crumpled farewell note between forefinger and thumb. Our drama begins with this convenient message, discovered precisely where searchers would find it, written on paper torn from the estate ledger with ink that matched Miss Seraphina's preferences. Yet observe the psychological inconsistencies. Formal address followed by informal signature. Generic sentiments for such a dramatic decision, and most significantly, the complete absence of any reference to the specific discovery that had made her planned marriage morally impossible. He gestured toward the recovered journal, its brass clasp broken and pages marked with the frayed blue ribbon. Miss Seraphina's private writings, found planted in Mr. Finch's lodgings, reveal a young woman who had uncovered something that transformed her wedding from a social obligation into an act of unconscionable complicity. Her final entry speaks of preserving what could be preserved while preventing what must be prevented, the words of someone contemplating not flight, but sacrifice to protect others from the consequences of her knowledge. Poirot's pale green eyes swept the assembled company with methodical attention. The ship's wheel charm, delivered by Captain Pembroke at precisely 10 o'clock, reappeared with its intimate inscription C2S and the taunting message, Wrong Harbor. This was designed to suggest romantic complications while directing suspicion toward a young officer whose only crime was harboring feelings he had never expressed inappropriately. The detective lifted the small vial of bay rum cologne that had provided the crucial olfactory signature. But it is this scent, mes amis, that connects every aspect of our elaborate deception. Present at the envelope in Seraphina's chamber, detected during the assault on Mr. Cobb, permeating the air at Mr. Finch's staged suicide attempt. A masculine fragrance that speaks of one particular individual whose presence marked each carefully orchestrated scene. Dr. Greaves shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his professional composure beginning to show hairline cracks. The attack on the gardener was precisely calculated to steal his gate key while creating the impression of desperate criminal activity. The gas poisoning of Alistair Finch was staged with medical precision, sufficient to incapacitate and create the appearance of suicide, yet carefully controlled to ensure survival and eventual testimony. Poirot produced the small splinters of black enamel paint, examining them with his magnifying glass. These fragments, found at multiple crime scenes, speak of someone whose transportation left distinctive marks, combined with the traces of medical soap discovered near the office window and the methodical application of orange flower water to create false sensory evidence of Miss Seraphina's presence, all point to an individual whose professional training provided both motive and method for such sophisticated manipulation. The detective's voice dropped to a chilling whisper as his gaze fixed upon Dr. Greaves. The sedative you prescribed for Miss Seraphina's wedding nerves was not the mild preparation you claimed, was it, Doctor? Your medical knowledge allowed you to administer something far more potent, sufficient to render her unconscious for transport, while maintaining the appearance of natural anxiety. Dr. Greaves rose from his chair with visible effort, his weathered features showing the strain of 3 days of careful deception. You don't understand the complexities. I understand that Miss Seraphina discovered your systematic embezzlement of funds from the family's charitable trust. Poirot continued with relentless precision. I understand that her marriage to Sir Reginald would have brought new scrutiny to financial arrangements that could not withstand professional audit. Most significantly, I understand that you used your position as trusted family physician to silence the one person who could expose decades of carefully concealed theft. The revelation struck the assembled company like a physical blow. Lord Ashworth's face flushed crimson with rage and betrayal, while Lady Margaret gripped the arms of her chair with trembling hands. The elaborate trail of false evidence, the forged note, the planted charm, the staged suicide attempt, the assault on the gardener, all served to create a narrative that would satisfy official investigation without requiring examination of the financial records that would have revealed your crimes. Poirot declared, "You orchestrated not merely Miss Seraphina's disappearance, but the entire investigation that followed, conducting it like a symphony to ensure that suspicion fell upon romantic rivals rather than financial fraud." Dr. Greaves sank back into his chair, his shoulders sagging with the weight of exposure. "She was going to destroy everything," he whispered, his professional dignity finally crumbling. 40 years of service to this family, and she would have seen me in prison for borrowing what they would never miss. The charitable donations, the medical expenses. Who examines such things closely when they trust their family physician? "Where is she, Doctor?" Poirot demanded with quiet authority. The confession emerged in broken fragments. The isolated cottage in Surrey where Seraphina lay sedated but alive. The carefully planned timeline that would have allowed her discovery after a convenient interval. The desperate hope that the elaborate deception would prevent deeper investigation into decades of systematic theft. As Inspector Morrison placed Dr. Greaves under arrest, Poirot reflected on the psychological complexity of a case that had required all of his legendary analytical powers to unravel. The elderly physician's betrayal of trust was particularly insidious, using his medical knowledge and privileged access to silence the one person whose moral courage threatened to expose his crimes. The final irony was that Dr. Greaves's very expertise had become the instrument of his downfall. The medical precision of his methods, the psychological sophistication of his manipulations, and even his personal grooming habits had created an indelible signature that only methodical investigation could detect and interpret. As the morning light grew stronger through the drawing room's tall windows, Hercule Poirot made his final preparations for the journey to Surrey that would reunite Seraphina Ashworth with her anxious family. The bride who had vanished before her vows would be restored to safety, though the trust and innocence that had been shattered by betrayal would require far longer to heal. The case was closed, but its psychological complexity would remain with the detective as one of the most challenging examples of criminal manipulation he had ever encountered. The little grey cells had triumphed once again, proving that no deception, however sophisticated, could withstand the methodical application of logic, psychology, and patient observation to the eternal drama of human nature in all its fascinating and treacherous complexity. Justice had been served with the precision and elegance that had made Hercule Poirot the most feared adversary of criminals throughout the civilized world. And the truth had finally triumphed over even the most carefully constructed lies. The affair of the bride who vanished before her vows had reached its inevitable conclusion, not with romantic drama, but with the stark revelation of greed, betrayal, and the corrupting power of unchecked authority over those who trust without question. The recovery and final resolution. The journey to the Surrey cottage unfolded with the methodical precision that characterized all of Hercule Poirot's activities, though the Belgian detective's usual composure was tempered by genuine concern for the young woman whose life had been so callously manipulated. The procession of carriages wound through the autumn countryside with the gravity of a rescue mission, Inspector Morrison coordinating the logistics while Poirot sat in contemplative silence, his pale green eyes fixed not upon the passing hedgerows, but upon the psychological architecture of the crime now fully revealed. The cottage that Dr. Greaves had finally disclosed lay nestled among ancient oaks, its thatched roof and ivy-covered walls presenting the deceptive appearance of pastoral tranquility. Inside, the air carried the clinical smell of antiseptic beneath layers of neglect, while medical supplies arranged with surgical precision spoke of someone maintaining unconsciousness through pharmaceutical expertise. A comfortable bed with hospital-quality linens dominated the small room, and upon it lay Seraphina Ashworth, her auburn hair spread across white pillows like burnished copper, her breathing steady but shallow from 3 days of carefully administered sedation. Dr. Henderson, summoned from the village to provide immediate medical attention, confirmed that while her condition was serious, the systematic documentation found in a medical journal revealed Dr. Greaves' precise knowledge of dosages required to maintain unconsciousness without causing fatal complications. 40 years of medical practice, Dr. Henderson observed with professional disgust, and he perverts his knowledge to this purpose. The man understood exactly how to preserve life while stealing freedom. As Serafina slowly regained consciousness under careful medical supervision, her first coherent words revealed the moral courage that had precipitated her ordeal. "The charity funds," she whispered, her voice hoarse but charged with desperate urgency. "The Children's Hospital, the Widows' Relief Society, how much has been stolen from those who needed it most?" Lord Ashworth wept openly upon hearing his daughter's voice, while Lady Margaret's carefully maintained composure finally cracked completely as she embraced the stepdaughter she had feared lost forever. Even Sir Reginald, despite the personal humiliation of a cancelled wedding, expressed genuine relief that Serafina's disappearance had resulted not from rejection of their planned union, but from circumstances that revealed her extraordinary moral integrity. Poirot's investigation of the cottage revealed the meticulous planning that had characterized every aspect of this sophisticated crime. A small escritoire contained forged correspondence designed to support the narrative of voluntary elopement, while a wardrobe held clothing in Serafina's size, evidence that Dr. Greaves had planned for an extended period of concealment. Most disturbing was the detailed medical journal documenting precise pharmaceutical protocols, revealing a man who had systematically perverted his healing knowledge into an instrument of imprisonment. The full scope of Dr. Greaves's embezzlement soon emerged from the financial investigation that followed. Over 15 years, he had systematically siphoned nearly £20,000 from various charitable trusts administered by the Ashworth family, using his medical authority to approve inflated bills, create fictitious treatment records, and redirect funds to accounts under his control. His method was both simple and insidious, exploiting the trust placed in him as family physician to steal from orphans, widows, and the chronically ill who depended upon charitable medical care. The psychological portrait that emerged was of a man whose sense of entitlement had gradually corrupted his professional ethics. Dr. Greaves had convinced himself that his years of faithful service justified compensation beyond his official fees, using his intimate knowledge of the family's financial arrangements to fund an expensive lifestyle that included questionable pharmaceutical investments and payments to maintain a second household in Brighton. Serafina's discovery of the discrepancies during her review of wedding expenses had created an impossible moral dilemma. Her journal entries revealed a young woman who could not proceed with a marriage that would make her complicit in ongoing fraud, yet who also recognized that exposure would destroy the family physician who had delivered her into the world. Dr. Greaves had ruthlessly exploited this moral complexity, using her wedding morning anxiety as the perfect opportunity to administer the powerful sedative that would remove her as a threat, while creating the elaborate fiction of voluntary disappearance. The legal proceedings that followed proved both swift and devastating. Dr. Greaves's confession, combined with the overwhelming physical evidence that Poirot had methodically assembled, left no room for defense or mitigation. The elderly physician was sentenced to 15 years imprisonment, his medical license permanently revoked, and his personal assets seized to provide partial restitution to the charitable organizations he had systematically robbed. Captain Charles Pembroke's reaction proved particularly poignant, as his carefully concealed affection for Serafina emerged in the form of protective concern that transcended mere brotherly duty. The wrong harbor message, intended as a cruel taunt by Dr. Greaves, now took on different meaning, a metaphor for Serafina's journey away from a life she could no longer accept with moral integrity. For Seraphina Ashworth, the experience had profound and lasting effects that extended far beyond the immediate trauma of her ordeal. Her planned marriage to Sir Reginald was quietly dissolved by mutual consent, as both parties recognized that the foundation of trust necessary for successful union had been irreparably damaged. More significantly, Seraphina's discovery of her own moral courage under extreme circumstances led her to pursue a career in charitable administration, ensuring that the oversight failures that had enabled Dr. Greaves' crimes could never be repeated. Sir Reginald, to his considerable credit, sought Poirot privately to ask for the proper form to release a lady from promises that no longer served honor. A private letter to the lady and a public notice in the Times, Poirot advised. And if you wish to do nobly, a line that places the responsibility upon your affairs, not hers. The next morning's newspaper carried a brief announcement noting alterations in the arrangements by mutual consent, and the matter in those circles was thus made diplomatically invisible. As Hercule Poirot prepared to return to his modest flat in Whitehaven Mansions, he reflected upon the moral complexities of a case that had required all of his legendary analytical powers to unravel. The little grey cells had triumphed once again, but the victory carried with it the sobering recognition that the greatest crimes often wore the mask of respectability and hid behind the very trust they systematically betrayed. "Inspector Morrison," Poirot observed as their carriage returned to London, "you asked what I will remember of this case. I will remember that a bride who vanished before her vows did not vanish at all. She refused to promise what could not be kept with honor. It is a rare thing, this courage of omission. Also," he added with characteristic precision, "that the truth, she is never as simple as the lie. The lie tells us what we wish to hear. The truth requires us to work for understanding." The affair of the bride who vanished before her vows had concluded not with romantic drama or tragic loss, but with the stark revelation of how trust could be perverted into an instrument of exploitation. Justice had been served with the precision and elegance that had made Hercule Poirot the most feared adversary of criminals throughout the civilized world. Yet the psychological scars left by such profound betrayal would require far longer to heal than the physical effects of Dr. Greaves's pharmaceutical manipulations. The case would remain with Poirot as one of the most psychologically complex examples of criminal behavior he had ever encountered, a reminder that the human capacity for self-justification could corrupt even the most noble of professions when combined with opportunity and unchecked authority over those who trust without question. Order had been restored, truth had triumphed over deception, and the innocent had been protected, but the price of such victories was the eternal vigilance required to prevent trust from becoming the very weapon used against those who offer it most freely. In the end, Hercule Poirot had solved not merely a mystery of disappearance, but had illuminated the eternal struggle between human frailty and moral courage, a struggle that would continue long after the last echo of this particular drama had faded from the elegant halls of Ashworth Manor. Epilogue. Order restored. The autumn morning light filtered through the tall windows of Ashworth Manor's entrance hall as Hercule Poirot made his final preparations for departure. With characteristic precision, he adjusted his watch chain until it lay perfectly straight, smoothed his mustache to its customary waxed perfection, and surveyed the restored tranquility of a household that had weathered its greatest crisis with dignity intact. The days following Dr. Greaves's arrest had unfolded with the measured grace of a well-orchestrated recovery. Seraphina, her strength returning with remarkable resilience, had insisted on personally reviewing the charitable trust accounts to ensure that every stolen penny could be traced and, where possible, restored to its intended recipients. Her moral courage, which had precipitated the entire ordeal, now manifested itself in a determination to transform personal suffering into systematic reform. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, approaching him in the morning room where he had arranged his final notes with mathematical precision, I wanted to thank you for seeing what others could not, that sometimes the greatest mysteries hide behind the most familiar faces." Poirot inclined his head with gentle respect. "Mademoiselle, it was your own courage that exposed the truth. You refused to promise what could not be kept with honor, and in doing so, you protected those who had no voice to speak for themselves. That is a rare form of heroism." Lady Margaret appeared in the doorway, her elegant composure restored but softened by genuine humility. The stepmother, who had once orchestrated social arrangements with military precision, now carried herself with the chastened grace of one who had learned to distinguish between duty and conscience. "I owe you an apology that extends far beyond this household," she said quietly. "I taught Seraphina to value obligation above all else, never imagining that her sense of duty would grow into something far more demanding, a sense of justice that could not be compromised." "Madame," Poirot replied with characteristic gentleness, "the finest lessons we teach often exceed our original intentions. You gave Mademoiselle Seraphina the moral foundation that enabled her to recognize corruption when she encountered it. That foundation saved not only her own integrity, but the welfare of countless vulnerable people who depended upon charitable funds." Sir Reginald entered with the measured dignity of a man who had discovered unexpected reserves of character within himself. The cancelled wedding, initially a source of social humiliation, had evolved into something approaching relief as he recognized the fundamental incompatibility between convenience and genuine affection. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, offering his hand with sincere gratitude, "you have saved me from a marriage that would have satisfied society while disappointing the heart. There is wisdom in recognizing when one's harbor is indeed the wrong destination." Captain Charles Pembroke, standing near the window with the ship's wheel charm still clutched in his palm, managed a rueful smile. "I find myself grateful for lessons in navigation, even when they chart courses away from desired ports." Inspector Morrison arrived to escort Poirot to his waiting hansom, his professional demeanor enhanced by genuine respect for the Belgian detective's methods. "I shall not soon forget the importance of examining not merely what evidence appears, but who benefits from its appearance," he declared. "Dr. Greaves's deception was so sophisticated precisely because it exploited our tendency to accept convenient explanations." "Precisely, Inspector," Poirot replied, settling his hat at the perfect angle. "The criminal mind, when it possesses intelligence and medical training, becomes perhaps more dangerous than the simple murderer who acts from passion. Dr. Greaves understood both human psychology and pharmaceutical science well enough to construct a deception that might have succeeded indefinitely, if not for one crucial oversight." "Which was?" He forgot that the truth, like a persistent flower, will always find a way to break through even the most carefully constructed artifice. His very sophistication became his signature, and signatures, mon ami, can always be traced to their source. As the carriage began its journey through London's bustling streets, Poirot allowed himself the luxury of philosophical reflection. The case had revealed layers of human complexity that extended far beyond simple criminal behavior. The gradual corruption of professional ethics, the exploitation of trust as a weapon against the vulnerable, and the extraordinary moral courage required to sacrifice personal happiness in service of abstract justice. "The affair of the bride who vanished before her vows," he murmured to himself, watching the city pass beyond the carriage window, "demonstrates that the greatest mysteries are often questions not of who or how, but why. Why good people make evil choices, why trust becomes the instrument of betrayal, and why the preservation of moral order sometimes requires the destruction of comfortable illusions." The psychological portrait of Dr. Greaves would remain with Poirot as one of the most disturbing examples of professional corruption he had ever encountered. A man trained to heal had systematically perverted his knowledge into an instrument of exploitation, using his privileged access to steal from orphans, widows, and the chronically ill who depended upon charitable care. The gradual transformation from trusted family physician to sophisticated criminal illustrated how unchecked opportunity, combined with the dangerous self-justification that accompanies gradual moral compromise, could corrupt even the most noble of professions. Dr. Greaves had not begun his career with criminal intent, but had allowed small violations of trust to accumulate until they formed the foundation for increasingly serious betrayals. Most significantly, the case had illuminated the complex relationship between individual moral choice and broader social responsibility. Seraphina's refusal to proceed with a marriage that would have made her complicit in ongoing fraud represented a form of heroism that was both rare and costly, requiring her to sacrifice social expectations and personal security in service of ethical principles that extended far beyond her immediate circumstances. The dilemma of the moral individual, Poirot reflected, making precise notations in his personal journal, is that she must sometimes choose between competing loyalties, between personal affection and abstract justice, between the comfort of silence and the duty to speak truth that causes pain to those she loves. As the hansom approached Whitehaven Mansions, Poirot considered the broader implications of trust within professional relationships. Dr. Greaves's crimes had been enabled not merely by his medical knowledge and financial access, but by the fundamental assumption that a family physician would place his patient's welfare above personal gain. The systematic violation of this trust represented a form of betrayal that extended far beyond simple theft to encompass the corruption of the healing relationship itself. The detective's methodical reconstruction of the crime had revealed the sophisticated psychological techniques that intelligent criminals could employ to control investigation and public perception. Dr. Greaves had not merely committed crimes, but had orchestrated an elaborate theatrical production designed to direct suspicion away from his activities while creating a narrative that would satisfy official inquiry without requiring deeper examination of the evidence. Climbing the familiar stairs to his modest flat, Poirot arranged his case materials with the same meticulous attention to detail that had enabled him to unravel the deception. Each piece of evidence, the forged farewell note, the planted charm, the staged suicide attempt, the assault on the gardener, had been precisely calculated to support a predetermined conclusion while obscuring the true motivation behind Seraphina's disappearance. The criminal mind, he observed, settling into his favorite chair with characteristic precision, when it possesses intelligence and education, becomes perhaps more dangerous than the simple murderer who acts from passion or desperation. Yet it also becomes more vulnerable to detection, for sophistication leaves its own distinctive signature. As evening settled over London, Poirot made his final entry in the case file. The affair of the bride who vanished before her vows demonstrates that order is not merely the absence of chaos, but the active triumph of reason over the bewildering complexities of human nature. In every crime, however tangled, however seemingly inexplicable, there is always a pattern. One has only to look, truly look, and the pattern will reveal herself. The Belgian detective closed his notebook with characteristic precision, adjusted his small clock until it aligned perfectly with the table's edge, and prepared for the restorative sleep that would clear his mind for whatever new challenge tomorrow might bring. The little gray cells had triumphed once again, proving that no deception, however sophisticated, could withstand the methodical application of logic, psychology, and patient observation to the eternal drama of human behavior in all its fascinating and treacherous complexity. The case was closed, order had been restored, and justice had been served with the precision and elegance that had made Hercule Poirot the most feared adversary of criminals throughout the civilized world. Yet the detective knew that somewhere in London's vast expanse, other crimes were being planned by minds that believed themselves clever enough to outwit the forces of law and order. "They will learn," Poirot murmured with quiet satisfaction as he extinguished the lamp. that Hercule Poirot and his little grey cells are always ready to serve the cause of truth, no matter how deeply it may be buried beneath the most carefully constructed lies. The mystery was solved, the criminal exposed, and the innocent protected. Yet another victory for method, psychology, and the indomitable will of the world's most famous detective in his eternal war against the forces that would corrupt the delicate fabric of civilized society. The affair of the bride who vanished before her vows had reached its inevitable conclusion, but the eternal struggle between order and chaos, between truth and deception, would continue as long as human nature remained capable of both the greatest nobility and the most profound moral failure. In that struggle, Hercule Poirot would always stand ready to defend the innocent and expose the guilty, armed with nothing more than his legendary powers of observation, his methodical approach to investigation, and his unshakable faith in the ultimate triumph of truth over even the most sophisticated deceptions.